We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell.
Hi, welcome to the Money Matters podcast. I'm Laura Suter and I'm joined as ever by Danni Houston. Hi, Danni.
Hi, Laura. As you know, this podcast is all about helping women get comfortable with their financial lives. We've discussed all kinds of topics from buying a house, childcare costs and divorce. Today, we are talking about the menopause and how it can impact a woman's working and financial life.
And Danni, this is something you've got first-hand experience of, haven't you? The impact that it had on your kind of work and financial life.
Yeah, absolutely. I had very young kids when I first started to go through the menopause, and I was in my late 30s. And honestly, I just put it down to the fact that I was absolutely shattered. You know what it's like, young kids. And I went and saw my doctor, who actually was brilliant, and said, do you know what, let's just go and get a blood test and check your hormone levels. And my hormone levels were completely collapsed. So they basically said, yeah, absolutely. This isn't perimenopause, early menopause. This is actually the real deal. And for a little while, I was thinking, fine, no problem. My periods have stopped. That's it. But no, I started to struggle with sleeping. You've seen those cartoons, Laura, where women get a hot flush and they suddenly sort of go bright red and it's all very funny. It's not funny. It is like you have been set on fire from the inside. But the bit for me, which was really impactful on my working life, was my brain. You remember when you had a child and we talk about baby brain?
I mean, I'm still claiming I've got that 2 years on, but I don't know if I can blame the child at this stage, but yes.
Well, I'd heard about baby brain, but I hadn't heard about the menopause impacting your brain in the same way. And I got to a point where I really struggled to remember things. And I was working in live television at the time, and I was doing a lot of live broadcasts where you have to remember huge amounts of information. And suddenly I just didn't feel as confident as I had felt, and decided to make the move into radio again, because it just meant that I could have my bits of paper in front of me, my scripts and my notes. And that's what I did. Now, I was lucky because I actually managed to progress my career and earn a bit more money, but not everybody is the same by any stretch of the imagination. And some women find this period really difficult and it impacts their working lives negatively.
And you can fully understand that if you think about some of the things that you've talked about there, being kind of physically uncomfortable, having this brain fog, maybe not having the confidence that you had before, having this exhaustion. It's entirely understandable that all of those things would have a knock-on effect on your working life. But everyone's experience is different. And we actually did some research to kind of pull out some of the impacts that it had on women's lives. So we did a survey of more than 1,000 women who either were going through menopause or had already gone through it. And we found that more than a quarter said that the menopause had hindered their work life in some way. And actually that impact was much more acute among women who were working full time, with 42% saying it had a big impact on their work life.
I'm really not surprised that confidence is the thing that takes the biggest knock. And 6% of people said that they'd had to reduce their hours because they were just really struggling with being able to do the job and the symptoms of the menopause. And I must stress that everybody's symptoms are different. And 15% of people, which was quite a big sample of people, said that they needed to take leave or a holiday from work. And really worst case scenario, 4% said that they'd had to change jobs or had left work entirely.
Which is massive when you think 4 in 100 women going through the menopause felt that they couldn't even continue working. You can see the dramatic impact that could have on some some women's lives. But with all the talk of kind of the tight labour market at the moment, and the government is on a campaign to get more people working more hours, and particularly focused on that kind of over 50s age group, getting more of them back into work and going from working part-time to full-time. Focusing on this feels quite timely. And actually, it's Global Menopause Month this month in October. So it's all very timely, Danni.
It is very timely. It's totally planned that way. Despite the fact there's been an awful lot in the media over the last couple of years about the menopause. I'm thinking particularly about Davina McCall did a documentary about it, and Louise Minchin talks an awful lot about her experiences with the menopause. And some employers, including AJ Bell, have now implemented a menopause policy. It is still a difficult subject to talk about. We talk about taboos on this podcast quite a lot, and it is another taboo.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen that a little bit when we've been having internal discussions about doing this work. Some people feel a little bit more reluctant to talk about it, or are not quite sure how to phrase the conversation. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done, isn't there? And a bit later on, we're going to be talking about some financial tips on dealing with the menopause, in case that's something that impacts your working life, with our survey showing that 1 in 10 people have been financially impacted by going through the menopause. But we're also going to be talking to Jo James, who is AJ Bell's head of HR, about how to create a menopause policy. And actually, I started with kind of what a menopause policy is, because I think a lot of people who haven't come across it yet and haven't gone through the menopause, won't be aware of what one is.
And I was actually quite surprised, talking about not knowing what a menopause policy is. I was quite surprised that we did an event a few months ago, and a young woman came up to me at that event and said, "What is the menopause?" And I was quite surprised by that, because it is something that all women go through, but there's no shame in not knowing. There's no shame in asking those questions. And that's why we're doing this podcast. And that's why we hope more women will talk about it, and more employers will do menopause policies and put up posters and that kind of thing, and have a discussion. So I've been chatting to Sarah Coulson from Halcyon Therapies, which helps women deal with a whole range of issues, including the menopause. And I asked her what the menopause is. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to talk about the impacts that the menopause has on women's working lives and their finances as a byproduct of that. But I know a lot of people are still saying, just explain what the menopause is. So could you just give us an idea, a really basic outline of what it is?
Yeah, of course I can. Firstly, thank you for having me. The menopause is essentially a stage of life that women go through that takes us from what I like to think of the spring and summer years to autumn and winter. And it is just that. It's a natural transition. It's not a medical condition. It's not something that routinely needs medical intervention, although some medical intervention can help, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, it's a natural transition, and the body sees lots of changes during that transition. So you will have heard people talk about things like brain fog, short-term memory loss. So it makes it sound way worse than it actually is. But there's also things that we don't really talk about, things like pain and bloating, irregular bleeding, all the different changes that are happening to our menstrual cycle.
So it's sort of the opposite then of puberty, which is something that my teenage daughters are just going through.
It is. It's exactly the same. It's just as natural, and it impacts different women differently as well. So exactly the same as puberty. Some teenagers or adolescents fly through puberty seemingly without any problems. Exactly the same with menopause. Some women seem to fly through it. Some women don't fly through it, but just appear to be. And some people really, really struggle. So however you're experiencing it, it's real. However you're experiencing it is a valid response to the menopause. But try not to compare yourself to others, because it is exactly like puberty. People experience it completely differently.
So we are talking about menopause a lot more than we used to do. Yes. In the past, the sort of vision of a woman going through the menopause was always, that cartoon sketch where a woman from her toes to the top of her head suddenly goes bright red and has to stand outside in the freezing cold. as someone who has been there, I can tell you that is absolutely part of it. And my kids did used to laugh at me, but it's by far the only symptom. And what we found in this particular survey that we've done with women in terms of how this impacts their working life, it is that brain fog. It's that sort of feeling that you're slightly off from how you used to be, which then impacts how they feel about their ability to do their job and also their confidence.
Definitely. So many, in fact, I would say the vast majority of women I work with who are going through the menopause, it's not the symptoms per se that are the issue. The symptoms they tend to find annoying. It's the fear of the symptoms when it comes to workplace. So things like having to miss work because they're worried because they've got a big meeting and they're worried they might forget something, or one of the things we don't talk about with menopause is the irregular bleeding and the flooding that can happen with menopause. And when we talk about flooding, we mean an uncontrollable bleed. We know that the menopause essentially stops periods, but in that transitional period, you can get some unpredictable bleeding. And for many women, that's enough to make them take a couple of days off work because they don't know when that bleed's going to happen. So if they're at work and that maybe the toilet facilities are too far away, or they're stuck in a meeting, or they don't really even know what to wear, which is something so simple but so crippling that's impacting on so many women. Bloating, again, that's something we don't tend to talk about, but is a very real symptom of menopause. And again, things like that can prevent people from going into work because it's something so daft. You can leave for work in the morning being a size 12 and come back in the evening a size 16, 18. It can be that dramatic a shift. So rather than have to face that at work, a lot of women come to me saying, look, it's either that or I'm going to have to take even more time off. But we do have the symptoms like the brain fog and the fatigue, which physically do impact productivity at work as well, because, or it can do, it doesn't have to. Stress and anxiety make these symptoms so much worse. So the more you're stressing about it, the worse it's going to get. It's exactly the same with the brain fog element. So women are worried about the brain fog. They're worried about forgetting things at work, which is impacting massively, which is making them take time off, which is making them be less productive, which is cyclical. People get into a cycle then of the symptom, the fear of the symptom increasing, the increased fear, and it's just like a never-ending cycle.
Before we get on to what workplaces can do to help women who are going through the menopause to put things in place, simple things like having a fan on the desk.
Yeah.
What is out there in terms of medical help? Because I know for me, I went through menopause early. I was in my late 30s, and I did end up having a bit of a fight to get HRT. I think initially I dismissed it because when my mum used HRT, it didn't really work for her. But of course, that was a long time ago. And I didn't feel like I had enough information. I didn't feel like my doctor was able to give me enough information, enough time to make those decisions. And it was only after listening to a radio interview that I was like, oh, well, maybe I should go on HRT. And for me, it was, I'm back, one tablet, and I felt like I was back. Doesn't work for everyone, but it's an option.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important message, the fact that HRT doesn't work for everybody, because I think certainly recently the conversations have increased around menopause, which is fabulous, but HRT is being touted as the answer, and it's one of the answers. And HRT can come in different forms as well, so it's really important if you want to go down the HRT route, which is absolutely fine. Like you say, it's literally a godsend for so many women to get the right form of HRT as well, the right dose and the right form. I've heard a lot of people trying to almost like self-medicate by kind of assuming that their friend takes this HRT, so it's the HRT that they're going to get. But actually really take time to speak to your doctor if you can and understand exactly what dosage, what type of HRT is going to be beneficial to you. You also raised another really important thing that we don't talk about as well, or that's clouded in stigma. People think that the menopause is just something that women aged 55 and above go through, but there are so many younger women either going through early natural menopause or menopause due to other gynecological conditions as well. And so in those cases, HRT, if it's a natural menopause, HRT will be the solution. if it's your body's response to, or even a treatment mechanism for another gynecological condition, then HRT won't be suitable at all, because that will just exacerbate the symptoms. So it's really important not to dismiss somebody because they're younger. If they think they're going through menopause, if you think you're going through menopause and you're younger, don't dismiss it and say you're not old enough, because that's an old-fashioned rhetoric, really. So that's a really important point you raised. And in terms of other things that are out there, there are natural ways as well that you can sort of help you have a happier menopause as possible. The big one is stress and anxiety, because like I say, that makes things so much worse. So try and eliminate as much stress and anxiety as you can.
So we know that more and more companies are implementing a menopause policy. We've got one here at AJ Bell. We know that there has been a big push to try and get more women over 50 either back into the workplace or to work more hours. So clearly, from an employer's perspective, it is worth putting these measures in place. But what can a workplace do?
Flexible working is a big thing. So if somebody is struggling with things like bloating and flooding and irregular bleeds, if they're able to maybe work at home instead of taking a day off, that can be something so simple, but can make a massive difference to that individual who's kind of faced with the fear of going into work. Things like fans on desks to help with the hot flashes or the hot flushes, because they are real. I've been through it myself, so I know how real they are. It's not just a quick kind of, oh, I feel a bit warm. It's an all-consuming, isn't it? It's all-consuming, feeling like you're going to explode.
Yes, and it starts right at you. I mean, it is like
It
the
really
cartoon.
does.
It starts right at your very toes and sort of creeps up your body, and you do feel like you're actually on fire for a little while.
It's so true, and you become more sensitive to heat changes as well. So if you can have and I know this is sort of an expensive option, but if you have a heating system in the workplace that's consistent, so you're not getting those extremes of temperature as well, because you do, as well as the hot flushes, you do become extremely sensitive to temperature change as well, which is something, again, that people don't really realise. But having cooled water as well can help. In the workplace, if you have a water filter, would be a cooled water filter, or just a nice accessible cold tap of drinking water, which sounds daft, but something so simple doesn't happen in a lot of workplaces. Awareness raising posters as well. I know that sounds daft, but just raising that narrative around it, changing the rhetoric that women shouldn't feel useless. They shouldn't feel different people when they're going through the menopause. This is a natural transition. Things will change, but if they feel supported in the workplace and they feel able to talk about it, then that can make so much difference.
It is still in some cases a taboo subject,
yes,
but clearly it's impacting lots of women. And if we can have discussions like this, maybe more women will be able to completely avoid the issues at work and with their finances. And that's, of course, just a good thing.
Yes, definitely. So thank you very much for continuing the conversation as well. It's a very important one to be had. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Sarah Coulson there from Halcyon Therapies, and I learned a lot from that interview, because even though the menopause is definitely something that's on my radar, I mean, Danni, you talked about the fact that it's been in the news and in the media so much more. I think I'm still quite ignorant to the impact that it can have and the kind of full effect that some women can experience.
Because it seems like it's so far away. And, for me, it came completely out of the blue. And I was lucky because I was working in an environment where there were lots of women, lots of older women. And consequently, it was a topic that I didn't feel was taboo. It was a topic that I could talk about. But I have also found through those conversations that no two women's menopause journey is the same. And I think it's really important also to say it's not something that affects you just for a few months or a year. Certainly in my case, it was a good 7 years. And I think for that reason, it's really no surprise that what you said there, that it can impact women's financial lives. And we've spoken a lot of times about how the gender investment gap is impacted by life events, things like taking time off to have children, which can have a real impact on a woman's financial life. Well, this is just another one of those paths.
Yeah, and if you think about the kind of time that menopause can hit, obviously it varies for every woman. But if we think about the fact that we have that big impact, if you choose to have children, you have that big impact on your career in your kind of 20s, 30s. then menopause could potentially hit in your 40s or 50s, you can see how those two big financial hits could kind of merge into each other. And if we think about menopause affecting women, maybe on average between 45 and 55, that's the point in many women's lives when they might be thinking, okay, I've got a bit more spare income, my children are grown up, I'm a bit more stable financially, and I now want to stuff my pension pot full of money before I retire to kind of bolster my pension pot. Actually, if they take a financial hit from going through the menopause, that's really going to impact their ability to do that. And it's actually worrying that when we spoke to women who had gone through the menopause or were going through it, almost 60% said that they didn't know if they had enough money for retirement, or they knew that they didn't have enough money for retirement. So you can see how that financial hit around that time in your life could have really long-lasting impact.
Yeah, and it's never too late to start thinking about your finances, figuring out what you've got and where and whether it's enough. I know at the moment we've been talking about the cost of living crisis a lot, and it is hard to find spare cash for a lot of people. But lots of women in their 40s, you've still got 20 years of work where you can be adding to your pot. But I think it's really important that we're not just saying, all right, if you're in your late 30s, 40s, think about the menopause, because if you can think about it much earlier on. So for younger women, to say to them in your 20s, think about the menopause, think about having kids. It might be easier to think about having kids. Certainly it feels closer. But if you can start adding a bit more to your pot in your 20s, you've got all of that time to get that interest growing. And it can then give you a cushion to deal with any potential disruptions to your earning potential, and it's something that could stand you in really good stead.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of just good practice to be aware of what you've got saved and where as well, so that if you know that you're going to face some financial issues, or if you get to the point where you want to take a bit of a break in work while you're going through it, at least you already have a very clear idea of what money you've got, where it's sitting, how much you've got saved for retirement. And there are so many good kind of calculators online now that can project, okay, you've got a pension pot of this amount at this age, and if you carry on contributing X amount a year, this is what you'll be left with. And I think as much as possible, if you can engage with where your pensions are, for example, maybe consolidate them all into one, then it means that you can go into some of those decisions with a bit more eyes wide open about your finances. And it might actually mean that you're better off than you realize you are, and you can take that breathing space and kind of go through that and give yourself some time. So yeah, that's a good idea, whether you track that through just a spreadsheet or just kind of checking in every year or so and seeing where you're at.
I love that you say track that through a spreadsheet, because
I love spreadsheets, and I just know that actually isn't a normal way that people track their finances, is it?
It's not.
That's not very relatable. No. Okay. Well, you all just get me to do it through a spreadsheet. I love an opportunity to set up a new spreadsheet.
I might send all my stuff your way, because spreadsheets, I've had to get used to them, and I can now understand the beauty of a good spreadsheet. But if you'd have asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have just, walked in the other direction. But we know clearly that helping women to stay in work, helping them feel confident when they're going through the menopause, that their employer has their back, that they can talk about it, that there are things in place, it can only be a good thing, not just for employees, but also for employers.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been chatting to Jo James, who's head of HR here at AJ Bell, to talk about what a menopause policy is, how employers can build them, but also some tips on what employees can ask their employers for if they're going through some of those difficulties we talked about.
So, Jo, thanks for joining us. It's estimated that between 75% and 80% of menopausal women are in work in the UK. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to find out more about what employers can do to support women who are going through that process. Mm-hmm. So I've heard a lot about menopause policies, but could you just explain what exactly they are?
Sure. So like other people policies, a menopause policy is really stating what the employer will provide in terms of support for its employees who are affected by the menopause and how that support will be given. Effectively, it's a clear reference point for all parties, that, so everyone knows what should be provided. Good policies also provide wider context about educating and informing people like line managers about things like symptoms and what expectations there are of managers to support their staff.
So can you give us some examples of things that might be included on that policy? I imagine it's a bit like a maternity policy in that different companies will offer different perks and different support. But could you give us an example of some things that might be included in that?
So, for example, it'll lay out why the business has the policy, what it's trying to achieve. Again, a good policy will also provide some definitions, so to help people understand, what menopausal symptoms look like, and also, what, for example, like early menopause can look like, because not everybody's aware of all the symptoms that go with it. So, again, it's going to depend whether, you've got experience either yourself or through perhaps say members of your family, as to whether what's going on, and beyond that, it can talk about symptoms and also as well, what responsibilities there are for people and what adjustments a company might want to make to help people in the position where they are struggling with menopausal symptoms.
So, what are some of the kind of simple changes that an employer could make to help women in work that are going through the menopause?
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be really sort of extensive things. It's talking to the individual really about their personal circumstances, because anyone going through the menopause, it is a very individual experience, even if there are sort of common symptoms that are experienced. So it may be something like reasonable time off to attend medical appointments, which could include counselling, for example. It could be temporarily adjusted workloads, depending on what sort of experiences somebody's having at a particular time. If somebody's been off work for a longer period of time, perhaps a phased return to work to bring them back up to their full duties, that kind of thing.
And everyone, like you've said, everyone kind of has a different experience of menopause. So how do you design a policy that meets all of those different experiences from one extreme to the other, I guess?
Sure. So, I mean, I suppose at sort of basic level, the policy needs to acknowledge that everyone is different and that will require different levels of support and different types of support as well. So effectively it becomes an overarching policy, but then can also be applied to individuals based on their circumstances as well. So, which is how a lot of policies are written, to be honest. So.
And what about the financial side of things? Obviously, if we think about a parallel kind of policy would be maternity pay, and different companies would offer different, levels of pay for a certain amount of leave. Is there kind of a financial side to these menopause policies?
So I think that would depend very much on the organisation. At the moment, the majority of firms will manage menopause sickness absence or menopause-related absence through a sickness policy, which means, it'll link to company sick pay or statutory sick pay. So perhaps, this is something we'll see evolve over time, particularly as the population gets older and a greater proportion of the working population is older. Firms, of course, can apply a discretionary policy now if they want, but there isn't sort of a parallel policy to say, maternity pay at the moment.
Yeah, because a lot of people in the survey that we did reported having to use either unpaid leave or sick pay as a result of going through the menopause and still working. Is that going to be the best option for most people at the moment until we see kind of potentially companies bringing in specific pay for that?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest probably in a lot of cases, it's probably going to be the option that they have at this point in time. And that's not necessarily to say it is the wrong approach, but businesses have to find a way to support people, and this is probably the obvious route to go down. Where it could be better managed for people is perhaps where the reasonable adjustments piece comes in, that people find ways to help women who are dealing with symptoms at particular times, maybe certain points in a month, etc. That that's where say changing workloads or changing working patterns, for example, for a temporary period could actually reduce the need to take absence, whether that's sickness absence or unpaid leave. So it's really about both parties coming together, I would say, and seeing what options there can be.
And if you're someone who's at work at the moment who's going through the menopause and is struggling, what are some of the kind of realistic things you could ask of your employer? I think lots of people just wouldn't even know where to start with kind of having that conversation and what they could ask for from their employer. I know it will obviously differ employer by employer, but what are some of the good kind of starting points?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would suggest is always check to see if your company does have a policy in place. So sometimes these things can be well bedded into the intranet or something like that, or in the handbook. If there isn't a policy or, a direct policy about it, you could also say, look at the sickness absence side of things as well. But if not, so the ACAS website is actually a good place to start in terms of information. It has a specific section about menopause and work. And what it may do is help people to understand, the rights and also how they might be able to speak to their employer about their specific symptoms. So, so there's a whole raft of information and there's other information online as well. And if somebody doesn't feel comfortable, speaking directly to their manager, for example, as I imagine in some cases that, particularly if it's not somebody, you've got a long-standing working relationship with, an obvious point, if you're in a large organisation, and speak to, say, someone in the HR team or perhaps occupational health as a starting point. But if you're in a smaller organisation, a starting point might be to put something into writing first, perhaps say send an email to start the conversation and then ask to pick it up. If that's not going to be a viable route, then maybe there's another senior manager or, a senior colleague who might be able to facilitate the conversation for you as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because I think a lot of people might not realise that the support that their company might have, or just might feel a bit paralysed by not wanting to speak to their direct boss about it. So yeah, I think that's a really important point to, I guess, essentially just find out the information you can and see what support is available.
Yes, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for explaining all of that. It was really good.
Thank you.
Some really fantastic tips from Jo, and it's great to hear her experiences as well, because sometimes I think having that real life knowledge can help companies. If they draw on their employees' knowledge, it can make a huge difference. And Jo is very passionate about the subject, which I think has really helped pulling together AJ Bell's policy. And I have to say that of all the stats we got out of the research, it was a survey that Opinion carried out for us in August. I was most surprised by the fact that 84% of women who were either going through the menopause or had been through the menopause said that either their employer didn't have a menopause policy in place or they weren't aware that they had one.
So I'm going to have to confess here, I didn't realise that we had a menopause policy in place at AJ Bell. Obviously, I'm very aware now. I think because it's something that's kind of in the future for me, maybe I wasn't so engaged with that. But that said, I think even in my kind of early 20s, when I was starting out in a company, I probably would have been slightly aware of what their maternity policy was, which is a kind of similar parallel, maybe not the details of it. But I guess menopause policies are quite new things. And it's just really interesting to learn how employers can support women, but also, the kind of things that you can ask for as a woman of your employer if you feel like you need more support.
And it was fascinating talking to Sarah a bit earlier on, because it can be just such simple things. And I mentioned earlier about my experiences with hot flushes. And I do remember my kids laughing at me when I was cooking a dinner in the kitchen, a roast, and it would be boiling hot in the kitchen and I'd suddenly get a flare up and I'd have to go and stand outside. Sometimes, it was snowing and I'd be out of the glass door and they would be looking at me on the other side and just laughing. But simple things like a fan, thinking about air conditioning can make such a massive difference. And I think it's great that we are now talking about the menopause in exactly the same way that we talk about maternity policy. And when we first started discussing doing this podcast, I had to sort of stop and think, am I okay with sharing my experiences? Because I'd never really spoken about it before. And I think it gets easier every time I write something or talk to someone about it. It becomes more okay. And I think if this podcast doesn't do anything else other than make women aware and make them feel that it is okay to talk about it, then that is a massive step.
Yeah, and if you do have any kind of questions or comments that sparked off the back of listening to this podcast, then definitely get in touch with us. You can find us on Instagram at AJ Bell Money Matters, or you can email us on moneymatters@ajbell.co.uk. And we'd also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions of areas that you want us to cover in the future, any questions you want us to answer, anything like that, then do send it over.
And do give your friends a nudge if they haven't discovered the Money Matters podcast just yet. We cover issues from all stages of a woman's financial life, and our aim really is to make talking about money easier.
And we'd love you to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, but also to our newsletter so that you don't miss an episode. And you'll also get sent lots more great content, articles, and interviews and things like that. So just Google AJ Bell Money Matters, and you'll be able to find the link to sign up to the newsletter. But thanks very much for listening.
Thanks. Bye.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you whether certain investments are suitable or not. And don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that tax rules apply, and that the way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.